In today's show, we're talking about how you can get more background blur and subject isolation in your wildlife photos. Hey everyone, welcome into Magnolia Photography SC. I'm Jeff House, and I'm a wildlife photographer in Charleston, South Carolina. So I want to talk about Aperture today. This is a topic that I have found over the course of my photography career to be one of the most difficult aspects of photography to understand. Now, in the last episode, we talked about how to be more creative with your wildlife photos, but today I want to really kind of drill down when it comes to aperture. Because again, there's a lot of misunderstood concepts, and I want to clear those up. Now, when we are photographing wildlife, right, one of the things that we are trying to do, or one of the things that we do is we work with apertures that provide us with a little room for error, if you will, right? In other words, if we're photographing a running animal or a flying bird or whatever the case may be, anything that's moving and moving with some degree of speed and even maybe some degree of being erratic in its nature, we need to provide ourselves with an aperture that's going to give us a little bit of room for error, right? We want to expand our range of focus, right? So that it's not so critical, because if we have just the slightest miss and we're using wider apertures, it becomes far more likely that our photos are going to be blurry. And of course we want to try to avoid that at all costs in wildlife photography. Now, I don't know about you, I don't have the budget for it. And I'm assuming most of you who are watching are probably in the same situation, but I don't have an extra $15,000 floating around to go buy that 600 millimeter Sony lens f4, where I'm going to get some nice background blur, right? I'm using the Sony 200 to 600. I've shared this with you quite a bit before, right? And that fastest aperture is 5.6. And that, of course, is around the 200 millimeter focal length. And as we go into 600 millimeters, that aperture is going to change, right? It's a variable aperture lens. So when I get out to, I don't know what it is exactly, but probably somewhere in the 400 plus millimeters, 500 plus millimeters, that lens is going to change to a 6.3 aperture, right? Which means if we're looking at 5.6 to 6.3, it means we're going to get less blur in our background, right? As we go to those larger numbers with aperture. So if we go 6.3, or even if we change our aperture to f8 or f9, right? As we do that, we get less blur in our images. I really don't touch the aperture too much on that lens. I just let it hang between 5.6 to that 6.3. And if I need, in certain situations, to go obviously to an aperture that provides a little bit more depth of field, right? A little bit more focus there, then of course I will. But for the majority of what I'm doing, I'm not making that change. But let's talk about aperture, because even if we are photographing static animals, static birds, anything that's not moving, anything that's or moving very little, right? We might have a really busy background. We might be looking at ways as to how can we isolate our subject so that it pops off the background, right? When we're talking about genres of photography like portraiture, when I used to do those types of genres, I would use apertures of f2.8, f2, f1.8 all the time, right? And what you do is you put your focusing point on the subject or the person's eye, right? And if you get the eye in focus, that's really all that matters. So you get that eye in focus, and then the background blurs out extremely quickly. And what that does, of course, is you have your subject in focus, you have your background out of focus, and it just makes your subject pop from the background. So that's what we're really talking about today, is how can we incorporate some of those looks with wildlife photography? Because we're not going to be using the F2s, the f2.8s. You might have that f4 lens. Maybe you're using a 200 or 300 millimeter lens with the 2.8. For all I know, you could be using that, but I don't think for, wildlife photography, I would recommend really getting into those f2.8 ranges unless you know for sure that animal or that bird is not moving. But remember, when you're using those really wide open apertures, your focus is just a sliver. So any little mistake is going to be magnified. And it may not be the best look for wildlife photography because you could have the bird or the animal's eye in focus and the body of the animal could go into blur relatively quickly. And that may not be the best look for wildlife photography, right? You might want a little bit more of the body and the detail of that animal to be in focus. So those are things that you need to consider depending on the lens you have. But let's talk about aperture on our cameras and our lenses and how we can get more blurred backgrounds simply by changing our technique. There's three things that control the blurring of our backgrounds when it comes to aperture, regardless of what aperture you're using. The first one we were just really talking about, right? Your lens is going to have a certain aperture range. It could be f2.8 to f22 or f32. It could be f4 to f22 or f32, whatever the case may be. That doesn't matter. But what we want to understand is that whatever aperture you're using is going to produce a certain amount of blur with that lens. So that is one way. And that, again, was what we were just talking about a few moments ago. But let's just say hypothetically, right, you're using the lens that I'm using, that Sony 200 to 600, or you're using something comparable to that, and you have a variable aperture lens of 5.6 to 6.3. Does that mean that you can't create background blur or you can't get more background blur from that lens? And the answer is no. And the reason is because of reason 2 and 3 that allow us to get more background. Okay, so these are the concepts that many photographers don't understand, and I want to make sure we address these today. So the first thing that will also determine the amount of background blur that we have is not only focal length, okay, but distance to our subject. So let me explain what I mean. If we were to use an aperture, let's just say of f5.6, if we were to take a picture using that aperture from, let's just say, 50 feet, and we took a picture, and then we walked up to 10 feet from our subject, and we still used f5.6 as our aperture, and we took a second picture, that picture that we took from 10 feet away from our subject is going to have more background blur, okay? So if we were to step back to that 50 feet, essentially what we are doing is, even with a 5.6 aperture, we are going to widen that depth of field a little bit, okay? That is the effect of aperture when we are talking about distance from the subject. So the closer we get, the more background blur we're going to get. So this speaks to the fact of, starting off wildlife photography, it may not be the worst thing in the world to be using a 200 or 300 millimeter lens. This is going to teach you how to understand, and it's going to teach you techniques on how to get closer to the animals, right? Not by focusing your zoom lens, but it's going to show you how to get closer to the animals through technique of you moving, you being quiet. Now, of course, this goes without saying, but whenever we're talking about getting closer to the animals, it's essential that we talk about doing it respectfully, right? We've talked about this in previous shows. We don't want to get closer to the animals and do anything that interrupts their normal course of life. Maybe they're birthing, maybe they're feeding, maybe they're doing any other vital part of their life. And again, we don't want to be intrusive to that. So I have to just stress that part because I just feel like it's doing the right thing here. So that is one way that we can get more blur, is by getting closer to our subject. Even with a 600 millimeter lens, right? We got to remember that. Just because you have a 600 millimeter lens doesn't mean you have to take every photo from a great distance. Because remember, right, when we are taking photos, there are atmospheric conditions, right? There's haze in the environment. And some days, of course, it's worse than others. Not every day is overly hazy, but you will find that the more distance you have between you and your subject, the more those atmospheric conditions are going to impact your photos and really degrade them a little bit, right? It's gonna kind of wash them out. It's gonna make them a little bit softer. So always being closer to your subject is ideal, and it doesn't matter how many millimeters you could have a 1200 millimeter lens and you're still gonna want to get closer to your subject. That's just the way wildlife photography goes. But again, the key takeaway here is you can create more blur as you get closer to your subject. The third way that we can control background blur is by using our focal length. So if I have that 200 to 600 millimeter lens, if I take a picture from 10 feet at 200 millimeters, and I take a picture from 10 feet at 600 millimeters, the one at 600 millimeters is going to have far more background blur to it. Okay, so that's just, again, the way it works in photography. When we get closer, we're compressing the image a little bit, which always looks a little bit nicer. And we're going to get more background blur as we zoom in with our lenses. So those are the three ways, right? We can control background blur by the aperture we're using. We can control background blur by being closer to our subject. And we can control background blur by zooming in to our closest focal length when photographing our subjects. So there you have it, guys. Those are the three ways that you can really improve the background blur on your photos. So try a little harder to figure out how to get closer to the animals respectfully, zoom in and get that shot. And I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised with the amount of black background blur you're able to create using those techniques. Hey, I hope you guys found this video useful. I hope you learned some things that you maybe didn't know before. If you did, I would appreciate if you would consider subscribing to this channel. That's always a great thing. And be sure to share the video too so more people can see it. And of course, it's great for the algorithm here on this channel. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today, guys. I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Get out there and practice these techniques and let me know how you make out. Until then, take care.